Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. A couple weeks ago, I made a video of the book-related worlds that I would want to live in. And while I was making that list, I realized that there are a lot of worlds that I would not want to live in, especially in the books that I am reading. So I decided I'd go ahead and make the twin video to that. And so these are going to be book-related worlds that I would definitely not want to live in. And I'm going to go ahead, and this is not in any particular order, but the first one I'm going to mention here is one that I don't think will come to a lot of people's minds at first, but once you start to really think about it, living in Roshar or the Stormlight world would not be a great time if you're just a normal person. Just think of the opening of Way of Kings. You have a feudal kind of society with high princes and a king and everything. It doesn't seem like peasants or lower class people are treated all that well, and they're also at war with another race. On top of that, you're living in a pretty inhospitable world that is not really suited all that well for humans. You have the high storm coming in, and pretty regularly bad things are happening to the common folk. Now, obviously, if you are a super important person in pretty much any of these worlds, your life could be pretty comfortable and, living a life of luxury. But the idea of that just doesn't seem the most realistic. So odds are I would be probably a farmer or somebody who's dealing with high storms coming and probably destroying my home every now and again, and probably some kind of major or minor lord wanting me to pay more taxes, or all of these things, basically any kind of feudal system that you've seen. And that just does not sound like a good time. And obviously the threat of war and all of these other things going on as well. And as you progress, I don't want to spoil anything here, but as you progress further and further along the Stormlight Archive timeline, if you are not somebody special, it just seems like it's worse and worse to live there. And obviously more and more conflicts, and just so many things seem like they could go wrong. Next up is another heavy hitter of the fantasy genre, and this probably isn't too big of a surprise to many people, but this is going to be a Song of Ice and Fire, Westeros, honestly any of the kingdoms, Dorne, any of them probably would not be the best time. Once again, you are probably going to be a normal person. There are not that many kings and queens and your lords and everything that happens. Odds are you're going to be a normal person who is fighting for a battle for somebody you've probably never met and you don't really care all that much about, and you're going to die. And if you are somebody important, that might even be worse in this universe, because we see so many horrible things happen to powerful, important people. All the backstabbing and the maneuvering, the political stuff that is going on, just seems like a horrible place to really be anybody, because you have the Game of Thrones, as it is called, going on with the higher crust of society, but then you do just have the small folk, living in squander, hoping that they get enough food, all of the same things. These, obviously heavy ties back to like a medieval kind of period, but the threat of war is obviously happening if we're going through the timeline of A Song of Ice and Fire. War is breaking out. You have all the things that are happening across the Narrow Sea, and just once again, a horrible place for pretty much anybody to be. Obviously, I would love to think that I'm some, renowned knight who's undefeated and just, the greatest thing ever. But in reality, I'd probably just be a common soldier who takes an arrow to the knee and gets an infection and dies. Next up is my favorite fantasy series of all time, and that is going to be the Wheel of Time. We don't actually have a name for the continent. It's commonly referred to as Randland, and there are a couple major reasons why I wouldn't want to live here. Obviously, you have all of the things going on with the magic system. So if you're not familiar with the Wheel of Time, there is a magic system that is divided between men and women, and there's two different parts of the magic that each gender can call down and use. And unfortunately for men, their part of the magical power has been tainted by the Dark One, and if they use it, they go crazy. And not just like kind of crazy, like kill everybody you've ever loved crazy. And it's a huge plot point throughout the series and everything. And obviously, it just feels like it would be my luck to be a man who can channel and slowly goes insane and is put down by the Red Ajah or something like that. And even if I'm not that lucky, the odds that maybe a Trolloc comes and decides that my farm looks pretty tasty and I have to fight some weird combination hybrid creature that is, otherworldly, sounds awful. And then on top of that, you still have all of these same kinds of political maneuvering and the factions and war just between normal people, on top of all of these other possibilities that would just be not a great time to be a normal person in this world. Next up, we have a sci-fi story, and this is called The Never-Ending End of the World. And the basic premise of this book is that some people are and some people are not stuck in what are called loops. And if you are stuck in a loop, you are basically doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, right? So for some people, it's a very short loop. It might be they walk from the end of the hallway and that's it, and then they start their loop over again, right? So it's just they're walking endlessly down this hallway forever and ever and ever. So obviously, being stuck in a loop would be horrible. There's a couple questions in the book about like, what is it like to be in a loop and all of these things. And I'm not going to, once again, spoilers, not going to go into some of those revelations as we get further into the book. But obviously being stuck doing the same thing for eternity would be awful. Now, the other part of that story is that you might be a person who is not stuck in a loop, but you are living in a world with a bunch of people who are in a loop. Now, you can't disturb somebody in a loop, because if they do, they kind of freak out and attack you, is the basic idea that happens with the people stuck in a loop. And also things like food and water can be stuck in a loop. So you might not realize it at the time, but you might eat something that you think is not in a loop. And when its loop restarts, everything, it leaves your body, right? So it would be like all of the nutrition, all of the satisfaction that you get from eating and stuff leaves. So if you're starving to death and you eat something in a loop, you'll feel good. And then all of a sudden when that loop resets, it leaves you again. And playing that kind of game obviously just would be awful. It's a mixture of a science fiction, almost zombie-esque kind of story that just seems like a horrible world to be a part of. I'm not sure if I would count this book as fantasy or sci-fi or I think it's probably technically considered a thriller, but that is Run by Blake Crouch. Now, technically this does take place on Earth, but the basic premise is that a meteorite or something comes through the sky and all hell breaks loose, right? People basically start killing other people who they basically, if you've seen the movie The Happening, there's a little bit of, you get a little bit of The Happening vibe, but basically they want to enlighten you is basically what happens. And so we follow our main character and his family as they're trying to survive in this world where there's basically this an army of people who have seen these lights coming to kill people who have not. And if you have read it, you'll know that this is just, fast-paced action of survival. They go through horrible things, and basically you can't trust anybody you see. And that's an element to the story that would make living in this world just even that little bit more difficult, because you don't know if you can trust anybody. And that is a super hard thing when you're in a survival situation. You would want to work together with people and everything like that. And obviously all of the normal societal breakdowns that happen in anything like this occur in this book. And yeah, it would just be a really rough time to try to survive while also not being found out. And you have to think about people are everywhere. So like you're not safe anywhere. Even when you feel like you're out in the middle of the woods all alone, the odds that you might find somebody are pretty high. Next up, I have another fantasy series, and I'm going to talk about the Empire of the Vampire series. I think it's going to be a trilogy. I don't know exactly what the name of the trilogy is, but the framing of this book is basically our main character is looking back on his life. And if you really think about it, he's trapped. He's imprisoned by the ruling class vampires. And so in my mind, that means that our good guys have lost and that vampires have basically enslaved all of humanity, and being a thrall to a vampire sounds like a horrible time, right? One, you might just be like a cow to slaughter and they're just going to drink your blood and be done with you. Other times they might use you for all kinds of like horrible torment, basically just a plaything for their enjoyment. And all of those things just sound awful. And if you are one of the fortunate people who are still out there fighting against it, you're fighting against undead vampires who are significantly stronger than you, and you are outclassed in pretty much every single way. They have all kinds of different abilities and everything. And this is just one of those classic vampire stories where you do not want to be a human anywhere near one. Next up is a trilogy that I was not the biggest fan of, but I did find the world and some of the magic in this series to be interesting, and that is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, the first book being the 5th season. Now, like I said, I didn't really enjoy the book itself, but this is a world that I would definitely not want to live in. The basic problem in the world is that there is seismic instability throughout the planet for an unknown reason, and part of the magic goes into being able to control some of those tremors and help keep humanity alive. And unfortunately, it's not the most successful endeavor, and earthquakes and countless times reshape humanity, and constantly being on the verge of a apocalypse and death and destruction because of earthquakes and all the tidal, and there's no seasons, and just all of the extreme things that happen throughout this book just seem like a horrible thing to have to live in. There's also this element of how the government works throughout this book, where people with the magic abilities end up being basically bred with each other to make stronger magic users, and just all kinds of things that once again just not a good time for your average person. And the last book I'm going to mention, I have two more that I'm going to mention after this, but they're manga related. The last one I want to mention is a science fiction book I just read pretty recently, and that is called The Supernova Era. And the basic premise of this book is a gamma ray blast hits Earth, and everybody over the age of 13 has gotten basically radiation poisoning to the point where they're not going to live for longer than 9 months. Now, obviously, I am older than 13 years old, but So that would be awful because I'd be dead in 9 months. But I think the interesting thing here is to pretend that you're going to be the one adult who lives while you see the world become, run by 13-year-olds. And you can imagine how quickly some of that devolves into just absolute nonsense and how horrible it would be. Now, being the one adult there would kind of skew some of the ideas that are proposed in the book. But if you could just be kind of the fly on the wall there, that would be awful. Or say you're like a 13-year-old who is now basically in charge. You're the oldest one around. Just how awful that could be. Just think about all of the important like little things, like running power plants, just getting your mail, all of the little things that are going to fall apart now that there are no adults and everything is going to be run by children. What an awful place to live. This is an interesting book with some fascinating ideas proposed in it, but yeah, I would not want to be one of the 13-year-olds, and I would not want to be somebody who somehow survived, even though it goes against the premise of the book. And the last two that I wanted to mention, like I said, are manga. The first one being Attack on Titan. If you know anything about Attack on Titan, you know it is a brutal world. Basically, humanity is trapped behind 3 walls, and outside of those walls are these creatures called Titans. They vary in height, and they are basically humanoid creatures that eat people. And humanity has been basically fighting this losing battle against the Titans for as long as anyone can remember. And the Titans are truly terrifying. Imagine seeing a 15-tall naked humanoid creature that wants to eat you and is vicious and is coming for you, and you basically have no way to fight back. Like that is sheer terror. And even the people who are trained to go up against these Titans have a horrible survival rate, constantly are dying, and it just is a brutal world. And obviously there are some like political elements that get into the series a little bit, and yeah, just a horrible time. And I think a lot of people would expect this manga to be on a list like this, and that would be Berserk. If you know anything about Berserk, you know it is a cruel world to most people. If you don't know much about Berserk, it is basically we are following our black swordsman Guts, and man, Guts goes through a lot, right? But the basic world is a horrible place. It's infested by demons who are just kind of going after and killing humans. There's obviously also just awful people throughout this series who are doing awful things to innocent, normal people, and so that's another element to it as well. But these are all places that I would not want to live. I don't even think I'd really want to visit any of them. They sound like a horrible time to be a person there. But let me know if there are any book worlds that you would not want to live in that are not on this list. I would love to hear some that maybe I didn't think of off the top of my head when I was coming up with this list. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.